Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's 6th webinar in this 8-part series called Montana's Native People Perspectives on the Clovis Child, hosted by the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. My name is Diane Chalfant, and I'm a volunteer and board member of the Yellowstone Gateway Museum here in Livingston, Montana. The Clovis Child refers to the 12,600-year-old Anzick Site in Park County, Montana, the oldest known burial site in North America. Since it was first discovered in the 1960s, the site and the remains of the child buried there have been the focus of both cultural and scientific study. This series is career-oriented, and it's directed toward college and high school students, particularly tribal college students considering careers in the fields related to our speakers' work. We've asked our speakers to talk about their work, their various perspectives on the Clovis Child site, and their personal journeys in their professions. In a moment, I'll introduce the museum's interim director, Karen Reinhardt. But first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you'll know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenter, Duane Reid. Your questions will be anonymous. To submit a question, just type the question into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel, and Karen and I will read the questions and share them with our speaker. And as time allows, Duane will answer as many of the questions as he can during a Q&A at the very end of the presentation. We have many participants today, and we want to be sure we can track and answer any questions that you may have. So again, please use that Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We will be recording this webinar, and we'll upload it to Yellowstone Gateway Museum's YouTube channel after the event. And finally, following the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to take a very short survey. We'll use the survey results to help us to continue to improve this webinar series and any future programs like this that we do. Now I'd like to introduce Yellowstone Gateway Museum's interim director, Karen Reinhardt.
Thank you, Diane, for the introduction and for all of your hard work. We'd like to thank Humanities Montana for funding the webinar series and the Montana Office of Public Instruction for additional support. I really hope that our viewers will register for the 2 remaining webinar programs in this series. Next Tuesday, 1:30 p.m., join us for Preserving and Interpreting History, a Curatorial Perspective with Amanda Streeter-Trum. And the final webinar is a Summary of Anzick Site History with Dr. Stockton White on Tuesday, December 8th, also at 1:30 p.m. And now for our speaker introduction. Duane Reid is an enrolled member of the Little Shell Tribe of Chippewa Indians of Montana and serves as their Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. He has an undergraduate degree in Tribal Historic Preservation from Salish-Kootenai College, located on the Flathead Indian Reservation, as well as an MA graduate degree in anthropology from the University of Montana. Reid has participated in NASA's geospatial internships and enjoys working with STEM-related projects. And as you'll see, he has worked with GIS geospatial science and software, hyperspectral and multispectral imaging and analysis, as well as 3D scanning and processing of archaeological and historic artifacts. Please enjoy the presentation.
Well, hello, Duane. Do you want to talk about your work and what you do?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Duane Reid. I'm an enrolled member of the Little Shell Tribe. I'm also their TIPO, or Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Basically what I do is I identify, I preserve, protect, and manage cultural resources for my tribe.
Wow. That sounds like a lot of work, a lot of different kinds of work. What makes your job interesting?
I would have to say what I find most interesting about my job are the archaeological sites and the artifacts that are found in North America, especially the ones that are directly related and associated with my tribe. These archaeological sites can be really amazing, such as large villages consisting of dugout shelters, rock rings, and even cabins, or ceremonial sites that consist of large rock rings and medicine wells. Some of these are so big that it takes satellite images or drone images to really see the entirety of the sites. I also like to work with the artifacts. Some of these are projectile points for arrows, atlatl darts, and spears. Also have baskets, clothing, jewelry, and all sorts of different types of technology and tools from the past.
Wow. Do you want to, I mean, your job sounds so diverse, and you've mentioned in the introduction that you do everything from work in anthropology to geospatial work. Is your job what you thought it was going to be? I mean, when you decided that you wanted to be a tribal historic preservation officer, is it what you expected?
What surprised me about my work is I learned that oftentimes field surveys, archival research, ethnographic work, and discovery were done by non-Indigenous outside cultural resource management firms or archaeological firms, as well as the requirements of the Park Service Chippewa grant and how they expect a tribal historic preservation office to function and how they like it to be set up. Specifically, it's designed around tribes taking over the responsibilities for that the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, would for reservation lands. And so these two things have caused different types of problems and situations that really didn't expect to see. What I expected was to see a lot more Indigenous people actively doing the work, and I expected there to be a lot more work with the sites that were related to tribes instead of just based on their modern reservation boundaries. And this has caused issues where the tribes have come into conflict with outside non-Indigenous experts, and that was one of the basis for some of my research into the Anzick child and how important Anzick was, because at the time there was kind of two really main, very old, important human remains in North America, and that would be the Clovis Anzick child, and another really important human remains, the Kennewick Man. And what we've seen with Kennewick Man was that scientists and non-Indigenous scientists and tribes had come into conflict, and so that's what really surprised me a lot about the way that things were designed. A lot of times it seemed that the lead agencies for projects and the engineering firms would hire outside CRM firms and archaeologists that necessarily didn't have the same information that the Indian tribes had. And there have been a lot of times where it just seems that they'll put some survey information in front of you, and the Chippewa office is just expected to comment on the work that they did instead of being an active participant, going out in the field, helping identify cultural resources. It just seems like they're on the sidelines being commentators. And
no, I see. Well, you've been very actively involved in researching sites, and I know you had some imagery you wanted to show us about your work. Would you like to share some of your aerial work that you've done?
Yeah, for me, aerial imagery has been really, really important. It's really fun. It helps us to be able to see what goes on at the entirety of archaeological sites, and it's for me one of the best ways for me to keep track of and monitor our cultural and archaeological sites, because we can have time-stamped images, and if there's what's called an Archaeological Resources Protection Act violation, where archaeological resource is disturbed, I'm able to show through change over time that, here's images from satellites in 2013 or drone images, and then, here's our modern image that shows this damage to archaeological site, either by looters or a project that didn't have a permit that got out of bounds, all sorts of things. So for me, it's really important because it gives me the tools to be able to take care of a vast amount of cultural resources. And like I said, cultural resources aren't always found within the boundaries of the reservations, because tribes have been removed from their traditional homelands, or they have smaller reservations than what their Aboriginal territories once was. And so for me, the aerial imagery really gives me the potential to be able to keep track of these sites, regardless of whether it's private land or a different government agency, and do it in a way that's really effective. So I'll show some images of places that I keep track of with satellite, and some of the drone images that I have that are some of the more fun tools in my toolbox, I guess, to do this work. Does everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Well, so this, I'm not getting, all right, there we go. Wasn't flicking through it. So these are archaeological and cultural site satellite images that have been given permission to share for educational purposes through our Little Shell Tribal Council. And so what you'll see is, contrast on this is 3 blue dots, and these dots are markers. These are point shape files that keep the geographic location of these cultural sites, and I've placed them inside of what are called rock rings. These can either be from teepees, or some of them can be for ceremonial sites. So that's why we call them rock rings, because there's different types of rock rings out there, and they can be anything from medicine wheels to, I'll just say ceremonial sites. And you can see down in the bottom right hand corner that that's a pretty distinct rock ring around that dot. And the next image will be these same ones without the dots in it. All right, here's these are cabin sites, dugout sites. This is what I look for on a satellite image. I have them circled with red right here, and so you can see that that's what an old cabin, old dugout would look like. Here's the contrast without the indicators to show some of the things that I look for, that I analyze for. Again, you can see the dots. They're inside of the rock rings. Here's the same rock rings without the dots. Another village. These ones are most likely rock rings from teepees.
Wow.
And there's kind of 2 different types of teepee rock rings. What I'm starting to find is there's the larger ones, and what the theory is that the larger ones are from the horse culture. So they're able to have bigger, larger teepees by the time the horses were adapted, and you have that plain culture. Where prior to this, the smaller ones were the dog culture, and dogs would pull travois or packs. And in my tribe, we had sleds. So before horses, we had some dog sledding that was pretty extensive, and there, dogs were a beast of burden. So even amongst the teepee rings, there's sort of a different different style. And these are more rock rings. We'll move through them quick, but you can see them in contrast how close some of these roads are. I've seen some of these 2-track roads, like you can see this true 2-track road looks like it goes over it, right over the top of a teepee ring. So, and sometimes, you know, you can't see these things as well, or the entirety from the ground. You know, you maybe see one or two, and they're so hard to get good photographs of, you know, so that's why with something like this, I could say this is an image from 2013, and then, you know, we could pull up an image from much more recent, and let's say maybe there was a, you know, a pump house put there, or a cell tower, and maybe they didn't have their permit. So this helps me keep track, or, you know, looters or anyone, this helps us keep track of artifacts. It's one of the things that, you know, as technology gets better and better, the public's able to get a hold of, you know, these types of images and stuff. That's why, as Indigenous people, we need to stay on top of these issues so that we can monitor them. And I think, as much as possible, there's some tribes who maybe might even want to, you know, keep their cultural sites blurred from different, you know, public Google Maps and things if they're able to be seen. You know, it's you got to know the technology to keep up with it. And I use it to, you know, actively monitor these things, because our cultural sites are all over the place and under different jurisdictions. And, you know, the way they set it up doesn't usually meet the needs of the tribes, because sometimes we've been removed from our traditional homelands, and they can be in such diverse places. So, and I like to fly drones. Here I can show some drone images.
It seems like your kind of work has changed tremendously in the last 20 years, going from, you know, monitoring mostly on the ground to being able to use drones or use those satellite images or the other images. It just seems very different.
Yeah, yeah, I think it really, really has changed. I've been doing this. I was in school for about 8 years, and I've been actively a Chippewa for my tribe for 4 years now. So when I first started, I had an associate's in tribal historic preservation, and I think this is all it's going to let me share. Sometimes I guess the drone images will have to wait. I can't get them to pull up, but maybe it was too sensitive of stuff to show. Sometimes things have a way of just figuring themselves out like that.
Working out, yeah.
You can get the idea. Yeah, you know, when it comes to the educational requirements to be a TIPO, tribes have sovereignty, so you know, there's nothing that forces us to have any type of educational requirements, because the tribe can decide who they want to be a tribal historic preservation officer, and there'll be all sorts of different types of cultural experts and people that have the knowledge to be able to do a good job as a TIPO and don't necessarily need that formal education, although it really helps. I come from a very knowledgeable Little Shell family that's been really active for generations after generations. So culturally, it was very natural for me, just like anyone learning, you know, American history or whatever. I was raised with knowing all the stuff Little Shell, and I had my associate's degree in tribal historic preservation, and that's when I became the TIPO, when I approached my tribe to become the TIPO. And the chairman said, "You're the TIPO now." And so I got to kind of freestyle it. I went in expecting to be some guy's sidekick, right? That didn't happen. Wow. I was the first TIPO for my tribe. So I kind of got to invent it myself. And this was out of necessity, because I didn't have any money or really a lot of capabilities. You know, we were still a state tribe, although we're federally recognized now. And so for me, the geospatial sciences, the drones, the satellite images, those really became important tools for me to be able to do my job, keep track of our cultural resources, and be able to effectively manage them. And you know, I keep a geodatabase, and when someone's going to do a project, I ask them first thing to send the shape files, and it'll show where their project's going, and I can put it in with my files, and it'll show, you know, whether or not they're near sites and things like that.
So was the geospatial work something that you got as part of your first degree, your associate's degree, or did you learn about that later?
No, that was a huge requirement for, it was first ever program of its kind at Salish-Kootenai College in Pablo,
Oh,
Montana. When I first attended Salish-Kootenai College, I decided I wanted to do business, because prior to that I would do my own contracting for construction work on Flathead Lake. And I took a pre-European contact class, because when I got into Salish-Kootenai College, even though I knew a lot about my tribe, I wanted to know more. So I dove through the library, reading every type of book, and immersed myself in the knowledge, the available knowledge of my tribe. And I wanted to get a pre-European contact, and, you know, get that broad view. And during that pre-European contact class, the professor, Dr. Jeff Bendermere, he approached me and he said he had a new program. It was to preserve and protect and manage cultural resources. We work with artifacts. We go to ancient sites, and you know, I gave it a shot, and it really made sense. And you know, he was really quite aware of the different problems that would happen. And oftentimes, you know, a person would be a cultural expert within their tribe, but then, you know, a person that holds a degree would come into conflict with them, such as you know, the Kennewick Man case. And so that's why I think it's important to have both, to know, to be educated, as well as very familiar with their tribes.
So you became the TIPO, and then did you go back to school to get another degree, or?
Well, so I was fully immersed in working towards my bachelor's degree at Salish-Kootenai College, and one of the major requirements is that you have to take the GIS. And when I was in the GIS classes, the professor offered up to everyone, said that there was a geospatial internship, a NASA geospatial internship that was full immersion for 3 weeks at Haskell Indian University. And so I asked the chairman of my tribe, I said, this is something that we got. I wrote up my proposal, which was to go through our historical documentation, and everywhere that there was a really good indicator where it would describe where we were, you know, like certain amount of miles up some kind of creek, then I made a journal of all these places where the description of where we were was clear enough to start looking for these places with satellite. And I wanted to make what was called a geodatabase that would mark and keep track of the geographic locations. And you do a thing called hyperlinking, to where then I was able to scan the historical documents and hyperlink it to.
Oh, yeah.
All this stuff is what I didn't know how to do it, but I knew enough of it, and I knew that this would probably be a pretty good project that would get me accepted into that geospatial internship. So when I had my associates, I ran it through council, got the blessing of council and the chairman, and they sent on the letter of approval with my project and proposal, and I got in. And by the first year we were really successful, so then they asked me back for a second year after I had earned my bachelor's degree. So it goes up to a bachelor's degree at Tribal Historic Preservation. And oh gosh, you know, I just figured I needed a graduate degree. There's a whole bunch of benefits to that, and that there was similar programs, just generally anthropology at the University of Montana. I covered it. So again, I put in, I asked the chairman of my tribe to write up one of my letters and applied to the graduate program and wrote my letter of intent, which was to get their assistance to more formally put together a tribal historic preservation office and get a graduate degree.
Wow.
So
So for students who are working on their associate or their bachelor's degree, I mean, it's kind of a big decision to go on and get a master's degree. And you mentioned you saw there were real benefits to it. It was what kind of was the main reason you just decided to keep going?
so that no one could say I got my job just because I was an Indian.
Wow.
That I could say that, hey, I know how to do science
Yeah.
just as well as anyone. Because that seemed to be a major problem, was that there would be, this conflict between, the tribe and other scientists. And that's one thing that I really discovered in seeing how far back it went and what ties this all together with the Anzick child. Because like I said, back in it was about 2015, 2016, for Salish-Kootenai College to get my bachelor's degree, I had to write a capstone research paper. And so I did a compare and contrast of the Anzick human remains, the Clovis child, which were really, really important, and compared it to what was going on with the Kennewick Man, another really, really old, important human remains in North America. And there were scientists that had sued to stop the repatriation of Kennewick Man under NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, because they said that they didn't think that, Kennewick Man qualified because he had, according to scientist James Chatter's Caucasoid skull, where he used an old type of science, skull science, that gave him maybe kind of a racially biased conclusion that really blurred it. The problem was there's theories that the Indians that make up our modern Indians that are in North America were the descendants of late arrivals from Asia, had wiped out a former Clovis, had wiped out the Clovis culture and this former European culture that had made it to North America and built the mounds. And so there was all these kind of real crazy kind of fringe theories that had an effect on our identity. And what the physical anthropology scientists basically did was blurred Kennewick Man's identity by passing off as a Caucasian. And then even when they did the physical examination after they won and were able to do the physical examination, they came to the conclusion that he was maybe Ainu, or it wasn't our modern Native Americans. And it took, there was the difference with the Anzick child. They were able to do DNA, and from that DNA, it showed that modern Native Americans were the closest related people to that child, and that, Sarah Anzick and her family realized, this was a baby that died, and these people buried it in a really, really caring way. And even though, these are the only remains that we have associated with the culture, the Clovis culture, she made a decision to work with the tribes personally to repatriate these remains because she knew we were the closest living. And that was like a really big difference. And I seen how we could get the science to work for ourselves, and I seen how there can be these conflicts. That was another thing that I noticed when it came to maybe some things like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. There's places that are in compliance, universities and other collections, in a way that everything that they had previously labeled as sacred or had been identified, yeah, that's been given back, but they've yet to go through the whole process of seeing what the Indians ourselves have told them, like, this is sacred, this is important, because they might just have something that's really important, such as a doll, and yeah, it's a doll, but you know, it takes a cultural expert from the tribe to be able to say, no, 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 this is something else. This isn't just a doll. This belongs to this ceremony, or this belongs to this. So, you know, there's still a lot of work to do. And when you have the education behind it, it gives you the background. I kind of think of it as a lingua franca. You know, when you learn the anthropology and the language, then it helps, you know, the experts and everything to be able to communicate effectively and have this sort of foundation to work on, because we've seen in the past there's been quite a times conflicts from what the Indigenous people know and are saying, and you know, what some of these non-Indigenous experts have said. So that's why I think it's really important to get more Indigenous people involved in these fields.
Well said. Thank you. Let's see. You know, I don't have any more questions, and I think we'll open it up to see if anyone in any of our participants have questions. In the meantime, you know, Duane, earlier when we were talking the other day, you were talking about the use of sort of aerial light imagery to identify like wild rice. And do you want to talk about that? I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, one of the great thing about our satellites, or a really good, what I found to be a really good type of a science that's really beneficial for tribal historic preservation work, is multi and hyperspectral analysis of what's called the electromagnetic spectrum. And so what we see is visible light, you know, Roy G. Biv, the rainbow light spectrum. On either side of that, you have ultraviolet and infrared. And so there's this whole spectrum of information called electromagnetic spectrum that we have, that we can actually measure and analyze. It's how scientists are able to measure light from a star or a planet and know what types of minerals that they're made out of, and gases and stuff, because there's something called reflectance, and that's measurable, and it can be unique depending on different types of minerals, plants. So you can use it to identify the software. The GIS software has a way to use it to identify plant species, which oftentimes can be really important cultural resources for tribes. And if you get satellite imagery, you can look at broad areas of land. And if you have known locations of these plants, like I was able to, there's oral tradition in my tribe that the tribe was able to get wild rice, would cultivate in our traditional homeland. Who knows how much cultivation as it was natural, you know. But I was like, well, you know, there's supposed to be some wild rice around. I wonder if there's still any around in this area. So I did a study when I was at the University of Montana, where I got satellite imagery, 4-band satellite imagery. So when you get the electromagnetic spectrum, you got hyper or multi-spectral imaging. What that means is it's broke down into bands or channels. And so I got 4-band imagery, which is really simple and it's free, and the government puts that out. And that 4th band is what would be called the infrared or near infrared. So it's the regular light spectrum. and then the extra band, the infrared, which is really good for plant identification, and they have a specific, it's built into the software, so a lot of times you don't even have to write your own algorithms. You can just check a box and it'll run the NDVI algorithm for you. So
it's just amazing what you were doing. So you were trying to figure out if wild rice still existed in places that you wouldn't normally, you just look at like a marsh area, you wouldn't necessarily see it, but using the electromagnetic spectrum work, you could figure out it was still there in places.
yeah, so
Wow.
I got the images from the wild rice beds over in Minnesota and measured the reflectance, basically told the software this is the reflectance for wild rice, and there's a classification system called segmentation, ran that, so it memorized it, and then I was able to analyze the bodies of water. I'm still a few steps away from being able to conclusively do it, though, prove that that's wild rice, because one of your last steps when you do research and an analysis of satellite imagery, aerial imagery, is what's called ground truthing, and that's when you just physically on the ground go there and be like, yep, there it is, or you're like, oh no, what happened? I completely thought this was rock rings and it's gopher holes or something. Yeah, so it's ground truthing, it's your last part, and I've yet to go and be able to do that, but I think I'll be able to soon. I was hoping to this summer, but just as 2020, and so I was stuck not being able to do that work, but in the near future, when I have a project in the area, then I can go.
I just think it's neat that you work with objects, you work with plants, you work with you work with all kinds of things, and you get to sort of integrate knowledge from all different areas to do the kind of work that you do. It's a lot different than what I thought it would be. It's really neat to hear you talk about it. I've got one more question for you, and that is, the other day we were talking about lichens and lichens on rocks and dating lichens. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? That was pretty cool stuff too.
Yeah, that's interesting. That has to do with some of these rock rings, and the theory is that I've located a ghost town that's in pretty close by to where some of these rock rings are, that has a still existing cemetery with tombstones, and it's really similar habitat. Haven't gotten very far along on it, but the idea is that we would be able to go to these tombstones because they'll have a date written on them, and be able to go from there on the growth of the lichens and compare it to the stones in the rock rings, because they're just so hard to date. And I can do a certain amount of things, like just in general, if they're not very covered in lichens, then maybe they're not as old as the ones that are, and the ones that are covered in a lot more lichens are, sunk in the ground deeper than the newer ones. So just the more evidence and the more science you can put behind, your theories. So that's one of the theories behind, the bigger rock rings for the teepees versus the smaller rock rings for the teepees. That's another thing. There's not as much lichens on these ones, and they're not sunk in the soil as deep. If you see something that's been pretty new, it maybe have a little indentation where it is. And, some of these are almost completely covered in soil. So, the multiple lines of evidence is generally pretty good. And that's what I like about the archaeology, is that, history can be pretty biased. And then we can also, with our oral traditions, be just dismissed as, that there's not enough evidence. And when it comes to the archaeology, we can get around that, and we can get around, some of the biases, because it's another line of evidence. And oftentimes the archaeology will go ahead and support the oral traditions, have that extra information to be able to support some of these oral traditions. That's another skill that I really like with the GIS is participant GIS, where you have maybe a traditional knowledge holder, and you can't necessarily bring them out into the field because they're elderly, and sometimes it's just arduous, wilderness situations, and you can put this software in front of them and these satellite images and these aerial images, and you can ask them, you can say, so when this important episode happened, or this place that we would do this cultural activity, where is that at? Where are these important places? And they can mark those, they can tell you where to mark them, and then we can use that information to make real world choices on major projects that come through, and do it in a way that's really understandable for all the people and in the project on either side of.
Wow. Wow. All right. Well, we don't have questions, so I think we'll, I don't know, turn it over to Karen, or do you want to provide any wrap-up comments, Duane?
I'd just like to say that I think it's really, really important and really exciting for Indigenous youth students to follow this path into anthropology and archaeology. We need more educated people in these fields on our side to not only understand the other scientists, but to also be able to do this work so that we're all working together. I just can't stress it enough. Out of all the fields that you can get into, if you want to do self-discovery, you want to go on a journey, going to the places that your tribe used to be and holding these artifacts, and going, sometimes there are huge towns and villages that haven't even been documented yet, that no one even knows about. Only 10% of Montana has even been professionally surveyed. And I think the other 90% should be done with Indigenous people included, because it brings us back to where we used to be. And every time I stand in a teepee ring, and I'll have different friends and family and colleagues, I'm like, oh, we're back into the drama at all. This is where we were supposed to be. So for a little while, we can put back Indians for us, I guess you could say.
That's great. Thank you so much, Duane. We do have one question that I would like to ask you. The question is this: what can Indigenous youth do to sort of get their feet wet?
To get their feet wet in tribal historic preservation, or archaeology, or anthropology, I would have to say it really depends on your age. If you're over 18 and you're fairly new, maybe don't even have an education, you could approach your cultural preservation office or tribal historic preservation office and see if you can't become a monitor, where you monitor a cultural resource while a project was going on, or see if you could participate in maybe an excavation or some type of a cultural activity. If you're younger, I would say, stay as involved with your tribe as possible when it comes to cultural activities, and that'll keep you on the right track. And if you see anything in your regular education that'll bring in any cultural or archaeological resources, I would say go for it. See what your tribe and your current education facility have to offer that's related in these fields.
It sounds like youth might also be able to conduct oral histories of elders and their family members, because that ties in nicely with a lot of the work that you're doing to kind of put the stories together with the archaeological sites.
Yeah, I would think that would be really wonderful, and a person could easily do that. And it helps them know. One of the first things that I did when to guide me through everything in my education was I went and interviewed my grandma, and that way I learned all the nuances and the details of everything, and that, you know, kept me focused, and kept me from going off in the different directions. And so yeah, I think that's, yeah, that way you get to connect with your family, and it's just a win-win for everyone, that way.
Yeah. Well, great. Any other questions? Last call for questions. Otherwise, I guess we'll wrap things up. I really want to thank you, Duane, for your wonderful presentation. We have 2 remaining webinars in the series. So again, next Tuesday at 1:30 p.m., please join us for Preserving and Interpreting History, a Curatorial Perspective with Amanda Streeter-Trum. And on December 8th, please join us for a summary of Anzick Site history with Dr. Stockton White. Each of these live webinars will be uploaded almost immediately to our YouTube channel following the event. So we really hope to see you next week. And thanks again, Duane, for a great program.
Thank you, Duane. That was really interesting.
You're
Bye,
welcome. My
everybody.
pleasure. Bye.
Bye.